The air inside the rusted hull of the overturned M113 armored personnel carrier smelled of burnt copper, diesel fuel, and rotting meat. Out in the pine forests of Northern Virginia, the world had died 4 months ago. It hadn't been a quick, merciful death, either. The pathogen, whatever it was, didn't just kill its hosts. It hijacked their central nervous systems, turning millions of citizens into relentless, cannibalistic husks. They called them ghouls, crawlers, or simply the quiet, because until they were right on top of you, they didn't make a sound. Inside the APC, 4 men were all that remained of the 3rd Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment. The fire team. Staff Sergeant Marcus Sarge Vance, a 38-year-old combat veteran who had done 3 tours in Iraq. He was the anchor, carrying a worn-out M4A1 and a quiet, crushing sense of responsibility for keeping his boys alive. Specialist Elijah Doc Miller, a 22-year-old combat medic whose knuckles were permanently stained with iodine and dirt. His medic bag was running dangerously low on morphine and pressure dressings. Private First Class Mateo Ghost Reyes, a 19-year-old scout who had grown up hunting in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Quiet, lethal with a bolt-action Remington 700, and terrified of dying in the dark. Corporal Jackson Jax Briggs, a hulking machine gunner holding down their heaviest firepower with a squad automatic weapon, SAW. Jax was loud, cynical, and kept his fear buried under a wall of dark humor. Chapter 1. The Breach. How many rounds, Jax? Sarge's voice was a low, raspy whisper. He was peering through a narrow slit in the APC's rear hatch. Jax unclipped a drum magazine, feeling its weight. Half a box for the SAW. 3 mags for my sidearm. After that, I'm throwing rocks, Sarge. Ghost? Vance turned to the young sniper sitting in the shadow of the hull, carefully cycling the bolt on his rifle. 8 rounds of .308, Staff Sergeant. 12 for my Beretta, Reyes replied softly. And my combat knife. Doc was sitting in the corner, applying a fresh strip of duct tape to a tear in his boot. We can't stay here until nightfall. The smell of the dead engine is fading, and they're starting to catch our scent. I heard them moving in the brush 20 minutes ago. Vance pulled out a battered topographic map. There's an abandoned forestry station about 3 miles west, up on Blackwood Ridge. It's elevated, fenced off, and should have clean water. If we can reach it, we can hole up, reset, and signal for an air extraction at dawn. Suddenly, a wet, scraping sound vibrated against the exterior steel of the APC. Scratch, drag, scratch. Jax froze, his hand resting on the grip of his M249. Everyone held their breath. Then came the thud. A heavy, lifeless body slammed against the side hatch, followed by a low, guttural rattle that sounded like dry leaves sliding down a drainpipe. They're here, Ghost whispered, his knuckles turning white around his rifle. We move now, Vance commanded, racking the bolt of his M4. Jax, you hit the hatch and lay down a burst to clear the threshold. Ghost, you take point and lead us toward the tree line. Doc, stay in the middle. I'll take the rear guard. Once we hit the forest, we run silent. Got it? Hoa, the 3 answered in unison. 3, 2, 1. Pop it. Jax threw his shoulder into the heavy hatch, shoving it outward. A gray, emaciated figure with milky, sunken eyes collapsed into the opening. Before it could snap its shattered jaws, Jax thrust the barrel of his saw into its chest and squeezed the trigger. Thump thump thump, the short burst tore through the creature, throwing it backward into the mud. Go! 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 Sarge roared. The 4 soldiers spilled out of the APC into the gray afternoon light. The clearing was a nightmare. Dozens of infected, some wearing torn suits, others in blood-soaked flannel, were stumbling out of the fog, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Ghost sprinted ahead, his eyes darting across the tree line. A lone infected sprinted toward him from behind an oak tree, moving with terrifying, unnatural speed. Ghost didn't hesitate. He raised his Remington, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle cracked like thunder. The bullet hit the creature mid-stride, dropping it instantly into the decaying leaves. Path's clear. Move! Ghost yelled. They ducked into the dense timber just as the horde converged on the burning hull behind them. Chapter 2. The Fog of Blackwood. The woods were suffocatingly dense. Pine needles cushioned their steps, but the thick, white fog rolling off the mountains made it impossible to see more than 20 feet in any direction. For 2 miles, they marched in a tight wedge formation. The silence of the forest was worse than the noise of the infected. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. "Sarge," Doc whispered, catching his breath as they paused in a dry creek bed. "My leg's holding up, but Jack's is burning up." "Look at him." Vance glanced back at the heavy gunner. Jack's was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as he leaned heavily against a mossy boulder. "I'm fine," Jack's grunted, wiping sweat from his eyes with a dirty sleeve. "Just carrying a 60-pound pig and 300 rounds of copper through a damn swamp, Doc." "Mind your own business." "Let me see your arm, Jax," Vance said, stepping closer, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jax hesitated, then pulled back the sleeve of his uniform. A deep, jagged scratch stretched down his forearm. The flesh around it was dark purple and inflamed. "It happened at the convoy wreck 2 days ago," Jax mumbled, avoiding Sarge's eyes. "It was a rusty fender." "Not a bite, Sarge. I swear on my mother's soul, it was a piece of metal." Doc knelt beside him, touching the swollen skin. "It's infected, but not that kind of infected. It's septic. He's running a high fever, Vance. If I don't clean this out with antibiotics soon, he's going into shock." "Which means we hit that forestry station," Vance said, looking up at the ridge towering through the mist. "No detours. No stopping." Before they could climb out of the creek bed, Ghost raised his hand, dropping to one knee. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a single creature. The ground vibrated faintly. Out of the fog above the creek bed, shapes began to materialize. Not stragglers, a herd. Dozens of dead were shuffling down the incline, channeled directly toward the creek bed by the steep terrain. "Back up," Vance ordered quietly. "Quietly, pull back." A loose rock slid under Doc's boot, clattering down the ravine. The movement in the fog stopped instantly. Dozens of pale, hairless heads snapped in their direction. A collective, screeching howl echoed through the trees, chilling the soldiers to the bone. "Contact!" Vance yelled. "Up the bank! Establish a defensive line." Chapter 3. The Stand at the Ridge. The squad scrambled up the slippery mud of the opposite bank. Jax scrambled up last, his body shaking from fever, but he swung his M249 over a fallen log and locked his bipod into place. "Feed the belt, Doc!" Jax screamed, his voice raw. The dead surged into the creek bed like a tidal wave of rotting limbs and gnashing teeth. Jax opened fire. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. Muzzle flash lit up the gray fog. The heavy 5.56 mm rounds tore through the front ranks of the horde, turning the creek bed into a meat grinder. Bodies piled on top of bodies, but the dead felt no fear, no pain, and no hesitation. They climbed over their own fallen, clawing their way up the muddy slope. Ghost picked off the runners on the flanks with cold, mechanical precision. Crack. Cycle bolt. Crack. Cycle bolt. 3 left on the right flank, he called out. "I'm out," Sarge shouted, his M4 locking back on an empty chamber. He pulled his sidearm, firing controlled pairs into the faces of 3 ghouls breaching the log. "Jax, keep pouring it on." "Losing feed," Jax yelled as the saw stuttered and jammed. A dead woman with her jaw torn off lunged over the log, landing directly on top of him. "Jax!" Doc roared. The young medic drew a heavy combat knife and drove it downward into the side of the creature's skull. It went limp, collapsing onto Jax. Doc hauled the heavy gunner to his feet, but as he did, a second creature reached out from the fog, grabbing Doc's tactical vest and dragging him backward down the slope into the creek bed. "Doc!" Ghost screamed, swinging his rifle around, but he couldn't get a clear shot without hitting the medic. Down in the mud, Doc fought frantically, kicking at the ghoul snapping at his throat. He held it off with his forearm, feeling the cold, putrid breath on his face. From the top of the bank, Sarge didn't hesitate. He slid down the mud, drew his sidearm, and pressed the barrel against the creature's temple. Bang! Sarge grabbed Doc by the shoulder strap of his armor, hauling him up. "Get up, son, up the hill." Jax cleared the jam on his saw and dumped the remainder of the belt into the ravine, clearing a brief 5-second window of safety. Out of ammo, Jax roared, throwing the empty machine gun aside and drawing his pistol. "We have to move. Fall back to the station," Vance commanded, covering their rear as they sprinted the final 200 yards up the crest of Blackwood Ridge. Chapter 4. The Safe House. They broke through the tree line and hit a heavy chain link fence. "Over! Get over!" Vance barked. Ghost climbed like an animal, throwing his leg over the razor wire at the top and dropping down onto the asphalt of the ranger station parking lot. He turned and caught Doc as he tumbled over. Together, they dragged Jax, who was slurring his words from fever and exhaustion, over the fence. Vance cleared the top just as the first wave of dead slammed into the chain link behind them, rattling the steel. The ranger station was a sturdy, two-story stone building with reinforced timber doors and heavy window shutters. Ghost kicked through the front door, sweeping the dark interior with his rifle light. Clear. They slammed the heavy oak doors shut behind them, dropping a steel security bar into place just as the first bodies began hammering against the outside wood. Bang! 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 Check the windows! Secure the perimeter, Vance ordered, breathing heavily as he leaned against the door. Ghost ran to the shuttered windows, sliding iron deadbolts into place. Doc immediately collapsed beside Jax, dragging the big gunner into an inner office away from the exterior walls. Doc, Jax gasped, his skin gray and covered in cold sweat. Tell me I didn't get bitten. Doc ripped open Jax's jacket. The scratch on his arm was red and angry, but the blood leaking from it was red, not black. You didn't get bitten, you big idiot, Doc chuckled weakly, tears smearing the dirt on his cheeks. You've just got bad blood poisoning. You're going to live. Doc dug into his medical kit, pulling out their very last bottle of IV antibiotics and a clean needle. He spiked the bag and inserted the line into Jax's vein. Meanwhile, Sarge walked upstairs to the main lookout tower. Through the dusty glass, he looked out across the valley. Below them, hundreds of dead were wandering aimlessly through the fog, surrounding the base of the ridge. But the chain link fence was holding, and the stone walls of the station were thick. On the radio console in the corner of the room, a red light was blinking. Vance walked over, picked up the heavy plastic microphone, and flipped the switch. Any station, this is Staff Sergeant Vance, 116th Infantry. We have 4 survivors at the Blackwood Ridge Forestry Station. Do you copy? Over. Static hissed through the speaker. Vance felt his heart sink. He lowered the mic, staring out at the gray horizon. Then, through the static, a faint, metallic voice cracked through the speaker. Copy, 116th. This is Dustoff 2-1. We see your location on thermal. Hold your position. We are 10 minutes out for extraction. I repeat, 10 minutes out. Hang tight, boys. We're coming home. Vance closed his eyes, taking a long, deep breath, the first real breath he had taken in months. He walked down the stairs to the dark room where his men were resting. Ghost was sitting against the wall, cleaning his rifle. Doc was monitoring Jax's pulse. Jax was fast asleep, his breathing steadying as the medicine began to work. Sarge? Ghost asked, looking up through the gloom. What's the word? Marcus Vance looked at his 3 boys, battered, bloody, but alive. A faint smile broke through his weathered face. Pack your gear, boys, Sarge said softly. Our ride is coming.